which is being set up in the GSU on the second floor landing right outside of the BU Arts Initiative. And so here's a example of the exhibit already set up elsewhere and what we'll eventually have here on campus. And in a place that now that the Metcalf Ballroom is being used as a classroom does receive some foot traffic. And the point of this is to be very visible and to be participatory. Next slide, please. So just to frame this a little more broadly, it might be strange that to some that an archaeologist, which is what I do, brought this exhibit to campus. This exhibit, I should say, is at 150 other institutions around the world, in the US and Europe and Latin America. It was originally intended for 94 institutions. And the number 94 is significant in that that is when the US enacted a policy known as prevention through deterrence, where the point was to drive migrants from the more common crossing points in urban areas along the border to the Sonoran Desert, with the idea that that would deter migrants from coming, is moving them into this hostile terrain. But with the end result, you could see the work of Wayne Cornelius and colleagues, that there hasn't been any deterrence. What it's led to is human suffering and a humanitarian crisis at the border. Now, the genesis of this project, to go back about 2 decades or so, was when Jason De Leon, who is depicted here, was working with us in Mexico. And you see on the left a site that we worked at when I was a graduate student and Jason was just finishing undergrad in the state of Tlaxcala, Mexico, called La Laguna. This site's about 2,500 years old, so it's a pre-Hispanic site, and you can see the material culture on the top left, a few vessels of the rain god that we found there. And Jason's stationed at a digital transit as we were mapping the site. This was in 2004. As we started to excavate the site, Jason became increasingly interested in the stories, the narratives that he would hear from some of the people we were working with about their harrowing journeys to the US. So for instance, there were 2 brothers who worked with us who had gotten into a shootout involving 2 coyote bands who were fighting over the migrants they had with them, and other such stories. And Jason's own family history includes a similar crossing. And so he became very compelled by those stories and took a really innovative approach, which we would call the archaeology of the contemporary. So using material culture, things like items that migrants use in making this crossing that you can see on the top right, a dump site for backpacks and water jugs, sometimes shoes, and using archaeological methods to document the material culture that's associated with this migration. And so there is a strong association with this project with hostile terrain and either material culture or visual culture. And so, it is a mixed methods type project, but both you can see the exhibit being this graphic display of migrant deaths at the border, of the human toll of this policy, and then accompanied with the sort of narrative and film that we'll get through viewing Border South. Next slide, please. The work that we did in Mexico intersected with this in different ways too. And something that you'll see in this documentary are the routes on train and then on foot. And there's some language here that migrants themselves use, which is, in some ways can be, well, a bit of gallows humor, like in an extremely trying situation that you'll see in the film, that many migrants, use humor probably as a coping mechanism in making this journey. And so the place that we worked at in Tlaxcala was very close to one of the major train hubs, Apizaco, which is sort of the halfway point between the port city of Veracruz and Mexico City. And then my other project in Teotihuacan, which is a major tourist site outside of Mexico City, is where the train enters into Lecheria, which is on the outskirts of Mexico City. So this sort of story of migration has been present in my time as an archaeologist. In the last 20 years, I've seen the changes that some are depicted in this film, including the arrival of paramilitaries that are funded by the US government to get migrants off these trains. So, early in the 2000s, you would see many more Central American migrants on the trains that they would call La Bestia, the beast. The beast is, the major rail thoroughfares used by migrants, or La Caminata, meaning the hike, the long hike. Another term they'd use for these paramilitaries, just to show you some of that sort of gallows humor, is los ninja turtles. So these paramilitary type force are using assault rifles. They're in body armor. They're all in black. And so migrants are, of course, looking out for them on the landscape. And this changed the migrant routes and also, just the suffering overall in this journey from Central America, with train being a very difficult way of getting up north, but one that's quicker ultimately than walking. But so, there's been changes over time in how that's happened and that Jason and team have been documenting. Okay, next slide, please. So I think, just the main message here for what the purpose of the exhibit is and these broader initiatives that we have on October 15th, we'll also have a panel of experts around campus working on migration and border issues. But the exhibit itself is a work of material or visual culture that is talking about state-sanctioned violence. It's talking about the toll of migration policies in human terms, of people who've lost their lives because they've been pushed to this hostile terrain, and the many thousands of others who have endured suffering because of this policy and making this trip. And so even though we planned this exhibit over a year ago, I think it's very much in line with other major social initiatives of commemorating people who've died needlessly because of governmental policies, and trying to draw attention to that so that we can enact change. Next one, please. And so, yeah, just finally, if you'd like to be connected to this, you can log on to the BU Arts Initiative page and fill out tags, have a time to come and sit at a table or nearby in the GSU and fill out tags that commemorate the over 3,200 individuals who since 1994 have died on this trip. And I should say, as a warning, as a trigger warning, that this is the exhibit has information, very graphic information of causes of death and the state of the bodies discovered in the desert. And I should backtrack to say that, part of what got De Leon and team interested in this, they were thinking about documenting sites and, garbage dumps, material culture, but they eventually started coming across bodies. And so this was something that they then reoriented some of their research plan to think about, this very visceral expression of death and suffering in the desert. And so likewise, in this video, there will be some tough subject matter, including about an hour in some forensic studies involving pigs that Jason and team do to examine what happens with bodies left out in the desert. So at the end, we will have Q&A. And so we'd ask you to put any questions, comments that you have in the chat. And I'm going to be joined by my colleague, Adela Pineda, who is in Romance Studies and the Director of Latin American Studies. And Adela is a specialist in Mexican cinema. And also her daughter, Susana, who is an artist and has worked on migration issues. So I'm very excited to be able to talk through some of the questions and concerns that you have after or during viewing the video, we can accumulate those and then and process them at the conclusion. So thanks very much for being part of this. And there are other initiatives like the panel or engaging with the exhibit that we really want to see for the BU community. And so now we'll start screening Border South.
Wonderful. If anybody has any additional questions they would like to ask in the Q&A with Adela and David, please feel free to add them in the Q&A button on your chat on your Zoom screen, and we will be happy to answer those and pass them over to Adela and David to respond to.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching and putting up with some technical difficulties and stoppage and slow bandwidth. But it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Adela Pineda, who...
David, I've lost your sound.
Oh. Can you hear? Yeah? Okay, Adela can hear. I hope others can hear too. Okay, good. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Adela Pineda, who is in Romance Studies and also the director of our Center for Latin American Studies and an expert in film. And so I see some of the questions that have been posted so far, well, Adela and I can attempt to answer them as best we can as, you know, a film specialist and an anthropologist. But also, just so you know, there is a Facebook Live event tomorrow, which will have the director, Raul Paz Pastrana, and the anthropologist, Jason De Leon, answering questions. So you could go right to the source because there undoubtedly will be some things that we can't cover. So yeah, Adela, I don't know if you wanted to start with any of these questions that have been posed already. I mean, I see one on having, you know, a protagonist, like the documentary conventions of having a protagonist and following his narrative. There's a few other threads through the film, and then how that connects with this very other form of data collection that Jason and team are doing. Do you have any first thoughts on that?
Hi, David, and thank you for inviting me to this to watch this film, and also for, you know, co-organizing this amazing exhibit, which I think is so important in our current context, coastal terrain, and it's very admirable the work that anthropologist Jason De Leon and his team are doing about the crisis at the border. I cannot see the questions, so I hope you could tell me about them, but let me start with that one about the narrative, the importance of narrative in a documentary. As I was watching the documentary, I was thinking, like, documentaries since their very inception have been always tackling social reality, and they have always claimed that they are going to portray social reality as accurately as possible. But they have always also contextualized the social reality according to their social, aesthetic, or political intentions. And this has to do with the way we use the film techniques and narrative as our tools to convey certain messages. And this is the case in this documentary. And what I thought was very interesting was this commingling of a filmmaker and an anthropologist to map a humanitarian crisis, a problem that goes beyond the US-Mexico border, and that has to do with our ethical situation nowadays. So I would say that I thought there were two protagonists in the film, two main protagonists, Gustavo and Jason himself. And their trajectories intersect, but in a different level, not because they meet throughout the path, but because both of their lives by crossing this landscape informed us and let us know many, many things about the complexities of the US-Mexico border. So I would stop there and then get more questions or ideas.
Yeah, just to tack on to that. So, I mean, the question was asking about the, you know, there's a main character or two with Gustavo and Jason, and so what do you gain and what do you lose by having that approach? And I'll add a little there, just knowing Jason's work and where it stands in relation to other sorts of studies of migration and border issues. Really, and like any complex human phenomenon, it's something that needs to be attacked from different angles. And so, what do statistical data of, say, number of deportees or people crossing the border in different ways, or people answering surveys in a certain way, there's that sort of data that maybe a sociologist might collect, or political science, or other branches of social sciences. Then there's something Jason is doing, which is relatively novel for this context of focusing on the material culture, a lot of it, but then also personal narratives. And so there's another question about the shelters. And so, and thanks someone for adding to my answer. So these shelters are, as far as I know, not sponsored by the Mexican government. That would be seen negatively, especially by the United States, who gives money for enforcement measures, not for these sorts of things. So there are mixes of NGOs and the church. And so the Diocese of Tlaxcala and a particular NGO are funding the albergue, or the hostel that we saw at the beginning in Apizaco. And part of the methods of Jason and team has been volunteering in those places from central Mexico all the way up. And so, for instance, one of his doctoral students that you saw collecting data in the desert was doing a study of those albergues, like a more social anthropological focus. So it's based on interviews and living with migrants as they pass through those particular shelters. So we have the personal narratives. I think those can be very powerful, and having a protagonist like Gustavo, who I think you're empathetic towards and rooting for to get his humanitarian visa, is part of connecting to that. Whereas like the material culture gives us a particular window, but it's mute. There's no narrative behind it. It's giving us another perspective, which can be fascinating, of like, archaeologists like to think that people and texts often lie, and materials can in some way be a little more objective. Of course, materials are also read by an observer, so we have to think of our own biases in that process. But those materials tell us something about the demographics of who's crossing, what it's like, what the materiality and physicality of this trail is like. And it includes things that we might think of as very utilitarian: backpacks, shoes, water bottles, but then also personal affects that are really talk about that person. There are shrines to La Virgen. There are other things that we might think of it as not in a strict utilitarian sense, but are important in terms of framing identity and what is this process, who's crossing, and other measures like that.
Yes, I totally agree. I think the figure of Jason as a character in the film is the way, or the vehicle for the spectator to come to terms to that reality. At the beginning, we just follow him. We follow his task as an anthropologist, gathering data, etc. But the camera frames his emotions, and not only those of the migrants, and the way he's discovering the cadavers of people in the desert, or how he sees not only affect, but curiosity, inventiveness, and the struggle for survival in those lost items in the desert, makes us very empathetic to a reality that seems very foreign and far away from us, although it's so close and in real real space. I would say also that the film tells us or shows us a reality, but it also suggests things that are not seen. And this is very interesting in this documentary. I read an interview with Raúl Pastrana, the filmmaker, who said that one of his main goals was not to portray the dichotomy of migrants as either heroes or villains. You know, as heroes who cross the border and they have these like huge goals, or as, you know, criminals who are not worth living. He wanted just to bring them as human beings who have a very common daily life like us, and that this technique was going to make us much more empathetic to the realities. And I agree, but I also think that his camera shows the very challenges that we have at very different levels. What really struck me was that during the whole trajectory, we envisioned a lack of legislation of these lives. There was only a small segment where Gustavo is getting his visa, and the state of Tlaxcala is apologizing for human rights. And then we see, you know, the ONGs, we see Jason, but we see that the huge problem or challenge we have is that migrants live in a constant state of exception. And this state of exemption is out there, and people are struggling, trying to help, trying to do things, but we cannot come to terms with this major issue that goes beyond filmmaking or beyond the anthropologist's task, right? So I thought that in many shots, the film kind of suggests this problem.
Yeah, and that's great you bring up. State of exception is something that permeates the book that Jason wrote, which is called Land of Open Graves, for anyone who's interested in that. And it gets to one of the other questions, which is, you know, the humanizing and dehumanizing that you see in the documentary, and I think in narratives about migration and border policy issues as well. And so, you know, we could think of humanizing Gustavo and other actors that we see, you know, heating beans for tortillas or making coffee, and that, you know, that sort of quotidian existence on the migrants' trail. And then the dehumanizing, which, you know, is well, it's part of political rhetoric when the president calls, you know, migrants animals and things like that. That's dehumanizing, and it's you know, part of overt discussion now, but also just sort of the creation of it's willful neglect to have a policy that's driving people to death or suffering, and creating first and second class citizens, first and second class humans. That's what our policies are doing by either, you know, not enforcing policies that are on the books, or purposeful policies like this one that are impacting and not having an effect, at least according to specialists. I again direct you to the work of Wayne Cornelius, who, you know, looks at migration issues and has said since '94, when this policy has come into effect, there's been negligible effect on migration trends. So it's just upping the cost and suffering and death toll for people. So there's that part of dehumanization. And then, you know, when you look at Jason's work, how do you get mute objects, the materials left behind, to say something, and in some ways to humanize, but through a process that, you know, leaves corpses in the desert and is dehumanizing.
I thought that was also very interesting in the film, because you see a contrast between Jason giving or transcribing the data of the objects found in order to have the records of so many victims of the desert, and then we see him talking to the mother of one youth who disappeared in the desert, and that's a very difficult moment. And the movie makes it with the close-ups. You know, you see the mother suffering, you see him having trouble talking to her, telling her that there are no records about him. And I think this contrast in the film is on purpose. I think the idea of we being alive and then all of a sudden become eerie bones in the desert, anonymous, without a name, without a burial, without a memory, right? And this is part of the crisis of not considering migrants not only as human beings but as legal beings, as people who have the right for a memorial when they died, right? So I think that is a very, very striking aspect of the documentary, because you see these two aspects, life and death not in the memorialistic way, but in the most material sense, decomposing corpse, bones, remains, etc. So, yeah.
Yeah, that relates to just a new question that came in about showing the dead or choosing to experiment with pigs. That's been a method that has been critiqued within anthropology circles, that he made that choice. And you can see in the film sort of how we go from the success story. Gustavo was actually branded as a success, to discussion of the dead. I think her name was Carolina, from Cuenca, Ecuador, and the woman who they first encountered doing their field work, and then met with her family. That's also part of the book. But then the missing, and what's happened to these people who are never heard from again, and could they just be lost to the desert? And so, I mean, that's where some of the experimentation came out of. It is in line with sort of what forensic specialists do, to have some empirical basis of what decomposition looks like. And then, to be able to say, well, all right, so since 94 to 2019, when they stopped counting, there's some 3,200 documented bodies in the desert. But how many others have been spread, like if those remains just get spread by vultures and wind and other natural processes in the desert, we can be talking about thousands more. In fact, there was a few weeks ago that New York Times Magazine, Sunday Magazine, had a story. It did seem to take a lot of Jason's work without attribution, but in any case, that particular article cites 8,000 as a figure rather than 3,200. 3,200 are the ones that we can actually have tags for, that with remains that are either identified or unidentified, and that's what's represented in the exhibit. But I mean, you can imagine there are thousands more that are not at all identified because of processes in the desert, natural processes and human processes, burial, etc. These are the sorts of things archaeologists and forensic specialists focus on, and what he's trying to replicate there.
Yeah, and I think also the problem with data, right? Because there is no data, as the lady was telling when she was recording all the remainders, etc. I was impressed that it was just paper and not computer databases, etc. So it seemed that there is a huge negligence, particularly because these people don't seem to be worthwhile for many others, right? So there is this aspect of as I said, of exceptionality, of they not belonging to any jurisdiction or any circle where they could claim their rights, right? That limbo is very, I could see that in the film. I thought that another very interesting aspect in the film were like the two scenes where Gustavo is getting his visa. I don't know if you saw, I wanted to ask you, is that Xicotencal? There was a picture of Xicotencal, the pre-Hispanic hero behind him when he was receiving his visa. And I thought this was a very interesting decision, cinematically speaking, symbolically speaking, because it tells us that the liminality of borders between Mexico southern Mexico and Central America is very relative because these people have the same ancestors. I mean, Tlaxcala is not there, but I'm talking about that community that you see between, you know, common Mexicans helping Gustavo in Tlaxcala, and then, you know, the border, dividing families, dividing friendships, dividing people, no? So culture is one thing, politics, borders is another thing. And I thought that that scene portrays that in a very interesting way.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, the U.S.-Mexico border has, you know, lots of cultural misunderstanding between it, but you could say the same thing. Of course, it's an artificial historical process, and the Tlaxcaltecas are Euro-Aztecan groups that have ties to the Euro-Aztecan groups of the American Southwest. The Tlaxcalteca actually went to Santa Fe. They helped found Santa Fe. I mean, so you know, this is an area that has always been fluid for all the periods of time that I study, millennia of time. And so these seem like modern impositions to someone with a, you know, deeper historical approach.
Yes. Yes, I also, somebody asked about the migrant centers, and there is another shot where these persons are speaking, and in the background on the wall you see Father Solalinde shelter. You know, Solalinde is this Catholic priest who was famous for his humanitarian work with Central American migrants. And I guess, you know, like those gestures the film makes and you don't notice, but they are there. They're telling you about what type of organizations, institutions are there trying to, you know, do something for the migrants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think we've covered all of them. That if I didn't cover this first one asking about specific policies, I mean, so the Hostile Terrain 94 exhibit is explicitly about the policy prevention through deterrence, and that was signed into law in 1994. That's why it's called Hostile Terrain 94, and still exists and is still causing this death and suffering on the border. And so the exhibit is really meant to highlight that to primarily a U.S. audience, though it is also in Europe and in places in Latin America as well. It's in Apizaco where this albergue is. So, you know, it's meant to have an international conversation about that policy, that it's not effective, it's actually harming people. And what can we do about that? I mean, can we create better policies, more humane policies? And so, not surprisingly, the exhibit was made to be rolled out in an election season, and that's purposeful, that, you know, people think when they vote.
We should add that as a background, like the U.S. government has imposed very, very harsh tariffs on Mexico if Mexico doesn't prevent Central Americans crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. So Mexico was forced to detain all the migrants in detention centers. So recently, Mexico created more detention centers, and this has been very polemical and has been not seen well by you know, progressive people in Mexico. But it is a geopolitical problem. There is a lot of pressure at the level of governments, right? So it's a complex problem.
Well, it's past 6, so if there are any other questions, please let us know.
I think we're good. I think we got to everything, thankfully. I really appreciate both of you so much for sharing your insights and experience and engagement with this exhibit and with this film. And we thank you, David, for your continued support of this and helping the Arts Initiative bring this to BU. And I just posted in the chat a couple websites. The first is tomorrow's Q&A with the director at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And that's going to be over on the Hostile Terrains Facebook page. And additionally, if anybody was interested in more programming and getting more involved with Hostile Terrain while it's at BU, you can check out the Arts Initiative website, which I also dropped in there.
Yeah, so thanks to the Arts Initiative, it's been a fantastic partnership, to be able to involve faculty, students. I forgot to mention, I think I had the slide up, but we do have a co-curricular through the hub associated with this. Students are helping to prepare the exhibit and then also present it to peers and other members of the community. If you'd like to get involved, look at the webpage and set a time to fill out tags. It's an intense experience. I even had my kids do it just to sort of feel like they're familiar with Mexico and they're familiar with this migrant trail, and to see what U.S. policy is doing to people, I think is impactful. And the panel, you will have Adela and many other colleagues from around campus, from CAS, from the law school, and so a range of experts who work with migration and border issues, and that's on October 15th. So thank you, Adela, for joining us.
Thank you to you, David, and thank you to BU Arts Initiative and to all the colleagues involved.
I see a final question is, will the recording be available? The discussion and I think the intro were recorded so that people could view later. But thanks everyone, be well, and think about how policies are impacting people and participate in this exhibit. All the best.